Good evening, everyone. Chip Cooper for FTC Guardian and my partner, Alan Cutts. Now, Alan and I are having a little bit of a technical issue here. I think Alan can hear me, but I can't hear him. But maybe we can get through this presentation anyway. So, Alan, let's see if they can hear you. Can you?
Yeah. Hey guys, can you hear me? Can you hear me here? Just give me a quick yes if you can hear me. Not that Alan. Yeah, they hear me, but they hear us both.
Okay, can they hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, I can hear you through my cell phone.
Yes.
All right.
So, hey, turn down your volume. Just for now, turn down your volume. I don't need to say anything.
The volume on the cell phone?
Yes. Or you'll just hang it up and I'll call you back later or something.
All right, I've turned it way down.
Okay.
All right, so we'll dispense with our fun introductions here that we usually have because we've had this difficulty and we're starting a few minutes late. So without any further discussion or introduction, I'm going to show my screen and let's see if Alan says that he can see it. Yes, you can see it, right? Okay. All right, so let's get started. You see, let's go back to the title slide. This is the fourth in our series of GDPR-related Hangouts for you. Of course, that's the acronym for the EU General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR. And tonight, with this GDPR number 4, we're going to be focusing primarily on data controller opt-in forms, which I'm assuming that most of our members are going to continue to do after GDPR goes into effect on May 25. Plus, there's a very important update regarding data processing agreements, which we covered in the prior GDPR series, which is GDPR 3. So there's an update very important for you. So hang on until the end of this call because you'll not only get new information regarding opt-in forms, but you'll also get access to some documents that may be very important relating to DPAs and specifically to GDPR 3. All right, let's get moving. The housekeeping announcement you've seen before. The presentation is for informational purposes only. It is not legal advice, and we're not affiliated with the Federal Trade Commission. So this is sort of the title slide there for GDPR. We've covered this before. What is GDPR? It's the new General Data Protection Regulation effective 5/25 of this year. It's going to have a massive impact on all organizations regarding how they store and use data if you are storing or using data of EU data subjects, meaning people who live in the EU. So that's a brief introduction that we've covered before, but that'll get us started. Now, in terms of talking about opt-in forms, one of the important definitions you need to understand is the definition of data controller. Because if you are collecting data directly from an EU data subject, such as through an opt-in form, you are a data controller as defined here. A person who either alone or jointly or in common with others determines the purposes for which and in the manner in which any personal data are or to be processed. That's a long definition, but generally the key is you need to understand down in the bottom right in yellow, generally it means the party that is directly collecting personal information as distinguished from where you might be receiving it indirectly from a customer of yours, not directly from the EU data subject. All right, we all know opt-in forms. It's a form of consent and a form that is permitting you to collect information and to receive contact information and permission to send things like newsletters, product sales, all sorts of marketing emails and communications to customers and to prospects. It's the way you build lists, or one of the classic ways of list building. Now, there are 4 basic requirements regarding consent in order for you to collect personal information from EU data subjects through an opt-in form. And here it is, boiled down very succinctly. The consent needs to be freely given. And meaning that, among other things, there cannot be any pre-ticked or pre-checked boxes, which is a practice that a number of marketers have used up to now. So it has to be affirmatively ticked or checked by the data subject. It has to be very specific. No more bundled types of consents where you're saying you're consenting to be on our list and we can essentially do about anything we want to with your contact information, including retargeted ads. So it needs to be very specific. And one of the terms that's used to describe the specificity is that it needs to be granular. And I'll give you an example of that in just a few minutes. It needs to be informed, the consent that is. There can be no ambiguous statements, very specific and informed consent. And finally, the consent needs to be indicated by a clear affirmative action, clicking on a button, checking a box, that sort of thing. So those are the 4 consent requirements that we're going to be dealing with when we create and operate opt-in forms for purposes of list building. So let's briefly focus on the purpose of consent. And there are 4 specific purposes there that are legitimate reasons or purposes for collecting personal information from EU data subjects. You will see that the first bullet describes what we're talking about in this presentation, essentially opt-ins. We're not going to go into the other 3 types of legitimate data collection. The first one is clearly what we're talking about, opt-ins. All right, now also sort of winding up the basic rules that you need to understand regarding opt-ins, there is a record-keeping requirement that goes along with the collection of this information, because you need to be able to show to the European authorities, if necessary, the fact that you actually made these disclosures and received these consents. You need to be able to show who consented, when it happened, the disclosures that you made to that person at the time the consent was given, and how they consented. If online, data submitted and a timestamp to link to the version of the opt-in form, and was consent ever withdrawn, and if so, when. So somehow you need to be able to collect that information, because getting the consents up front going in is part of the issue. But the other part is on the back end, internally, you need to keep records to prove that you have complied with GDPR in terms of your opt-ins. So now we're getting to the specific examples of opt-in forms. And I have 2 specific examples that I want to present to you. The first one is one that corporate users typically use. It's a contact us form whereby you're saying, you know, if you'd like to know more, excuse me, about our products or services, fill out this form, ask us a question, and we'll give you information. So it's really pretty simple. There's only one very specific purpose for the opt-in here. And we're going to follow that with a more complicated one that is clearly what most of our members are doing, where there are very specific purposes for collecting email addresses, and we'll jump in that as soon as we cover this one, which is the beginning and of the 2, the more simple and straightforward. So if we look at it this way, this is an example of how the form might look if you're doing what I call a bifurcated approach. Now, the bifurcated approach means that you are going to have a very specific situation covering opt-ins only for EU data subjects, And then you're going to have the regular business as usual type of opt-in for persons who are not EU data subjects. So this would be the way that the form looks at the outset on your website. You see the contact information fields at the top. The title, of course, is Contact Us, and there's a field for comments or questions, right? But then we have this big, excuse me, let's stay here. You have this big question, resident of the EU, and you have radio buttons indicating either yes or no. Now, this is not pre-clicked. The no button is clicked, but not pre-clicked to show you what happens. If there is a no clicked, then there's no drop down. So there's just simply you go as we typically have, and there's a submit button, a link to the privacy policy, and that's the end of it. No real consent need to be given other than that and a link to the privacy policy. However, if the radio button is clicked yes, then what happens is there is a drop down, and you see the drop down here, which deals with issues relative to GDPR protection of EU data subjects. So let's look at this one. We have at the very top the same fields as in the other form. Now we have below it the drop down. So we have, you can see EU data subject. The answer, of course, is yes, which caused the drop down. And you see your data rights, and you also see the listing of the data controller and also data processors. And you look at the text for the data rights, it is freely given, or consent could be freely given, specific and informed based on their reading of this text. And you can also see in the right, it's for a very limited purpose. And if you look down, you see the contact information for the controller, that would be you, and any data processor, which could be Amazon Web Services for hosting, right? And then at the very bottom, you see another I agree question. I agree to the GDPR privacy notice, which is a GDPR specific privacy notice. More about that later. So when that is clicked, I agree, then you confirm your consent by clicking the button. And so by doing it that way, by organizing it that way, the consent is indicated by a clear affirmative action, which is one of the rules. So let's go back to the overall view. I think we can go forward to it and we're going to see it. So one approach is to have, this drop down depending on how the answer to the question is. Are you an EU data subject, right? Yes, there's a drop down. No, there isn't. Or you could simply have, no bifurcation and just have all this form apply to everyone and assume that everyone is an EU data subject and not have that question, just have the data rights description and the other information as well. So that's your option for a relatively simple, or not your option, but my recommendation as the first option, I guess, would be the better way to put it, for a relatively simple opt-in form based on a contact us concept. Now we get to one that is much more, I think, conducive to what most of our members want to accomplish. And here you see this is primarily an opt-in form for purposes of list building, right? You want to collect email addresses for purposes of marketing, right? And so the title here says sign up for the webinar, but it could be sign up for a free ebook, sign up for some sort of video, sign up for a white paper, sign up for something for free to entice the prospect to give you their name and other contact information. So the basic purpose is indicated in the upper right is for list building for email marketing. And you see here that you have the word consent used twice. In addition to giving your consent to receive email from us regarding the webinar, which is what they're signing up for, you consent to receive the following categories of email from us. So the basic purpose initially is to get emails regarding the webinar, but you also want to get, if you're list building, you want to get the consent to send additional emails. And so here you see a bunch of options. And you remember a little bit earlier, we talked about very specific consents. We cannot have blanket or bundle consents anymore under GDPR. The consents have to be granular, meaning very specific, and of course not pre-checked. So you see here that the person signing up, the prospect, can simply decide to go yes or no by moving these buttons from the no position, right? So product news, invitations, promotions, urgent messages, press releases, the data subject can decide any of those or all of them or none of them, simply by ignoring the buttons or sliding over for certain or all of them. So that's what we mean by specific granular consent. Then we have the same information that we had in the prior opt-in form, your data rights, very succinctly stated. And there's an option here, and I didn't mention it for the other one, but you could, instead of actually putting the text in here for your data rights and then the information about data controllers and processors, you could simply have a link. The link would say your data rights. You click it, it gives you this information. And then the link might say data controller / processors. That would be the link. The anchor text, you click on it and you go to a page that gives you this information, or as done here, you can present it in the opt-in form itself. So you have the option either to present the information there or to provide links to the same information to allow the design of this form to be a little bit more compact. So that's the type of information we're talking there. And then at the bottom, it's very similar. We have another, I agree, that has to be checked in order for the confirmation button to work. And there's a link to the GDPR privacy notice. Again, we're going to have a future webinar or a future Hangout regarding what that is and a sample document for you, but not at this time. So this would be a GDPR specific privacy notice. And you see with that button there, the consent would be by a clear affirmative action. So that's exactly how this process would work. So now we've covered a relatively simple contact us opt-in form, plus we've covered one that's more, more features, more types of consents that are requested for a true list building type of opt-in form. So let's move to the update I talked about. Previously in GDPR 3, we discussed the relationship between data controllers and data processors. We have now provided, as of the last couple of days, documents, not in the form, and this is important to see in the underline there in yellow, not in the form of our generator where you would go in the member area or members area to generate documents, privacy policies, terms of use, that sort of thing. We haven't had time to build all the logic into what would be, the way to present it in our generator. However, we have Word file templates, fill in the blanks with some marginal comments. So it's actually Word files that you can download and then use to edit as applicable, right? So it's going to be, I'll show you exactly where they're located in just a second, in the member area. But here's what you will find there when you click through. It's on the link I'll show you in just a minute. There are 2 data processing agreements, and we talk about them in terms of their acronyms, DPAs. There's one that you actually have signed, pen to paper. Some attorneys refer to this as wet execution, meaning ink, right, pen to paper. And then the other one is a click-through or an electronic version. The actual text of the DPAs is really the same, but the format is a little different depending on whether it's a signed version or a click-through version. So those would be the DPAs. And then we have associated with these DPAs 2 web pages, very simple web pages, one that would indicate a list of sub-processors and a process for providing additional listing on the page, and then for your controllers to maybe lodge notices of objection. That's all explained. And then the second web page would be regarding links to your trust and compliance documents, which would include your GDPR data notice or privacy notice, that sort of thing. So these are the documents in Word file template form that are available. And here's where it's located. If you've been in the member area recently, you know that there's a whole series of links on the right side of the home, the basic page there, the dashboard page of the member area. And at the very bottom, you can see well, let me go back. You see these two new links, GDPR guidance and GDPR documents. So the guidance, by the way, includes links to all of our prior GDPR Hangouts. And probably tomorrow, not only am I going to have the upload of this video replay of this Hangout, but Alan's going to make sure that it's also listed here so you won't have to go looking for it in a separate place. It will be linked here as well. So GDPR 4 will be added here. The first three are already there. So it's very convenient for you to go back and review those. And then, of course, the other link, GDPR documents, would be the link to these Word file templates that we just talked about. So that's where it's located. Very, very, very efficient and very simple and easy to find. So in conclusion, the takeaways here from the GDPR 4 presentation are really four basic ones. Data controllers collect data from EU data subjects directly from them, and that's what you're going to be doing as with your opt-in forms. The second one is data controllers, of course, must get specific consents for the processing. And those consents need to be very specific and granular, as we've just discussed. Number three, data controllers must develop record-keeping procedures internally to be able to prove that the consents were given, that sort of thing. And then number four, we have this GDPR 3 update where we now have the template documents in the member area for you for the DPAs and the related web pages. So the searchable tags are these: GDPR, opt-in forms, sign-up forms, DPA, data processing agreement. That'll all be in the normal locations tomorrow morning, and maybe later in the day, Alan will get them up in the new area on the member area dashboard, as we just discussed. So that is the end of the presentation. I'm going to go back here to Alan and to me. And Alan is going to determine whether we have questions at this time. I can't hear you. Yeah, I can hear you now.
I have my phone muted.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So first thing, guys, is you now want to put your phone off to the side because this microphone is picking it up a little bit. Yeah. The first thing is when you log in, I made a change to it that Chip did the other day. Instead of having two bullets for GDPR guidance and a double over document, I changed it to just GDPR guidance and document. So some of them will be 4 videos with the
Well, look, can you hear me now? Yeah, I mean, I think if you go back and look at the replay, and particularly stop the replay and look very closely at the form, the basic idea is that there's got to be an initial purpose for the opt-in. Download an ebook, sign up for the webinar, or something like that. And the term, I hate this term. I hate it, but I'll just use it because it's so descriptive. It's sometimes referred to as clickbait, right? It's a way to entice someone to give up their personal information to you for list building. And you're giving away something for free. And it can be the webinar, or the ebook, or something similar, right? So that's what gets the attention of the prospect. But then below, I mean, previously, all you need to do is do that, put a link to the privacy policy and say submit, and you were done, right? But now with respect to GDPR, what you really want to be able to do is not only let them download whatever it is you're offering, but you want to use that email address for all sorts of marketing purposes, right? And of course, right now, the way things have always been, you didn't need to describe everything that you were going to use it for. In your privacy policy, you just had a very general, statement that said, we're going to use it for marketing, right? And that was about it. Now you've got to break down, we're going to use it for marketing into very specific types of marketing, very granular. We're going to use it for promoting other products. We're going to use it for promoting products of third parties. We're going to send you special notices, and each one of them has to be consented to separately. That's the new thing, right? Very separate consents. And if they don't say yes to one of those, you can't use the email for that purpose. You can only use the email to send them emails regarding the topics they select, if any, right? So there's a lot more going on behind the scenes in list building now, because some of them will select all, some will select none, and some will select some. So you're going to have different lists for different purposes based on the opt-ins. And then to even complicate it further, they have the right to withdraw consent. Right? So you got to take them off the list whenever they do. So there's a huge management issue with respect to your list, maintaining the list, adding to and subtracting from the list, that sort of thing. But remember, there's always the initial request. Download a free ebook, sign up for the webinar, but then you have to list all the other specific types of consents for the specific types of email you want to send them for purposes of marketing. That's all we're talking about here. All right?
Company where only the EU subjects receive this. It comes with particular IP addresses, some EU IP address or something like that maybe shows a different opt-in page than from American subject or Australian subject or something like that. So can I hear Alan? Hey, can anybody else hear me? Oh, sorry.
Okay. All right. Let me make an important announcement at this time. And what I'm about to say is something that Alan and I have spent a fair amount of time discussing, right? And that is that the documents that we are now or have added as of yesterday, I believe, regarding the DPAs are somewhat complicated, right? Not so much in the basic text of the DPA itself, but then when you get to the attachments to it, which include the model clauses for the EU, and then there's some attachments to those that require very specific information. I've provided examples, as you will see, in these DPAs if you choose to download them. But what I cannot do and what we cannot do is to answer all the questions that you might have, because in doing so, we would be stepping over the line and practicing law. And we don't do that here. We're not a law firm. we're a training company. So one of the things we've been able to do up to now is, because of the logic built into the generator, and because the documents in the generator are relatively straightforward, right? There's terms of use. And most, if not all of you, can pretty much answer the questions correctly because there's context help there to help you do it. And it's a single document, and it's, you know, you can usually go through the process and gin up a document without having someone, an expert such as an attorney, assist you in doing so. And that's one of the beauties of our system, right? That's what we excel at, we believe, in presenting to you. But now we've crossed the line into something much more complicated, particularly in terms of how you fill in some blanks on the backside of this document, the exhibits and the attachments specifically. So what I'm saying is if you call up support at ftcguardian.com, we're not going to be able to provide answers to all these specific questions that you might have. So what you're going to need to do is to find an attorney to assist you, right? If you have those questions and you're not satisfied that you're answering them correctly with the information I've provided in the marginal comments, right? Because we're not able to go there under these circumstances. However, we believe that we provided something of great value to you, because now you've got the basic documents. If you go to an attorney, you're not going to have to pay the attorney whatever is the current charge for generating all this stuff. And you're going to be able to get some advice to zero in on exactly what you need to say about the specific types of information you're collecting and all the rest of it. So we believe we provided a really valuable service, but it's going to be a little different from what we have provided for you in terms of documents up to this point. Just want to make that very, very clear. Alan, you have anything to add to that?
Anything that you want to add to your stuff inside of FTC Guardian, what you can do is go to your privacy policy inside FTC Guardian, and the far right side of it, you click on edit it, and you can edit the privacy policy and just copy and paste whatever it is that you got right inside there. Click update, and it will automatically update to your privacy policy already on FTC Guardian. So it's a really simple. Anything you take from outside that you say, I want to add this to my privacy policy for the EU, you can absolutely do it. Now I'm going to go back to what I was trying to say earlier, and that was there's a couple of things. One is when you log into FTC Guardian, you'll probably see now a link for just GDPR guidance and documents. Instead of having two links, you'll just see one link there, all the videos with the other Word file down below that, so everything will be there. And then I said something about something I want to do is look with your hosting company or service provider. Because some of the things that I know that we'll be doing is just deciding, is this an EU subject, yes or no? If EU subject, show them a different page. If they're not an EU subject, show them our standard object page. That way we don't have to go through it. But we don't have that thing. We don't go after and market to EU subjects. Yes, they show up on our website, and yes, we have customers from the EU, but we don't specifically go after and market to them. So we're going to take a little bit of a different approach to doing that, so that not every single person has to go through that. Yes, I need you, no, I'm not, and go through that process. So those are some of the things that you want to look at.
And I'd like to make sure that we understand another point, and that is the big companies, multinational companies, and I'm not going to name any, but we all know who they are, right? They are taking the position now. Generally speaking, I've not seen any exceptions yet, that they are not going to do what I've referred to in this presentation earlier, which is to bifurcate the situation, meaning that we're going to somehow decide and skim off the ones who are GDPR data subjects, GDPR regulated, and treat them differently. You remember with the opt-in form, if they said yes, they're a GDPR subject, then all of a sudden it drops down and we give them all the things they need to do and decide as subjects, right? So the big companies have basically decided they're not going to bifurcate. They're going to treat everybody, including U.S. citizens, as if they were EU data subjects. And I think the reason is, I'm not sure, but the reason is it would be more complicated for them to operate two separate systems than one, right? Plus, they also, I think, are thinking about liability. It is much, I think, a greater probability that they could make a mistake for which they could be liable if they've got two systems they've got to manage, right? One for GDPR data subjects and one for everybody else, right? So they're just going to change everything and treat no drop downs, no GDPR data privacy notice just for data subjects. They're just going to have total change to their privacy policy for everyone, which would be GDPR compliant, and everything GDPR compliant. However, smaller companies, which almost everyone in our membership would qualify as, are almost always going to opt to bifurcate, right? They're going to separate out, as we've seen with the drop downs here, and the fact that you're not going to be amending your privacy policy. You're going to create a skinny version of a privacy policy that applies only to GDPR data subjects. Now, we haven't provided you a document yet, but we'll probably do that in our next GDPR Hangout, which would be GDPR 5. So we'll get that to you probably within the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, something like that. So the way you need to be thinking as a small to middle-sized company is bifurcate. Screen out the GDPR subjects and treat them according to GDPR compliance. But everybody else, which should be the vast majority of the people on your list. I talked to a guy just the other day who is a big internet marketer, and he said, well, I'm thinking maybe 5% of my list at the most, it would be coming out of Europe. And 95% is US or outside of the EU, right? So it doesn't make sense to him to just totally change everything for GDPR compliance. And I think that would apply to almost everyone, if not everyone here. So think about bifurcation, and we're going to provide you that separate GDPR privacy notice just for the data subjects in the next GDPR Hangout, which will probably be early in June. So just wanted, I think that'll help you just as a general understanding as to how to proceed.
Yeah, and do check with, I use Active Campaign. Move that phone away a little bit or just turn it down a little bit. Just, yeah. I use Active Campaign, and Active Campaign just came out with a process, usually the system that they already have where you can tick a box when you create a form, you can tick a box where they have to okay it, and then they okay it, do they do it? So we're going to use an Active Campaign, a Fusionsoft, November, probably any of these service providers request emails from. Either they've already built it in or they are building in real quick, because I mean, I know that, you know, when we collect email addresses, we get an IP address. So I can pretty easily look at the IP address and say, you know, EU or non-EU, and separate people out, you know, fairly simple like that. It's not easy, but it's not real hard. It just doesn't download the list to do that. So that's kind of the basics of it. Let's see what else we have.
Any other questions?
I'm rolling right now, see what we have up here. Yeah, the replay should be clear. Most of you have my voice as well as his voice, so we should be okay there. And the U.S. Senate said I would appreciate the choice of knowing what I want or do not want to receive in an email. I think it should be global. It could be global, Mary. I mean, you know, a lot of companies will make it a global issue. I mean, as a marketer, I mean, we got to remember that all of us wear two hats. If you're on this call, you wear two hats. You are a marketer, and if you're not a marketer, you're not in business. That's it, period. So you're a marketer and you're a consumer. As a marketer, we want to be able to market, to send emails to get people to buy our stuff, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. As a consumer, we want a lot more control. You know, we don't want people knowing what we do. So you've got to decide where you stand and how you're going to build your business as a marketer. So if you're not a marketer, you're not in business, period. What's worse, Alan? Let's just hold up to the phone or the microphone back. Yeah. Someone check. I am an EU resident. If someone check, I am an EU resident. Can I just say EU residents are not allowed to access my information? I would say yes.
Wait a minute. What is the question? I need to answer the legal stuff. What is the question?
If they click their EU resident and they say, I don't do business with EU residents, not allowed to opt in.
Well, I mean, this assumes that you're screening out EU residents and refusing to accept their opt-ins. That's one option. I don't like it. I don't recommend it. The better approach, the recommended approach, is to screen out EU residents and just put them through a process that complies with GDPR. It requires specific granular consents. So I think screening out potential customers is not a good idea, generally speaking. But screening them out and moving them into another process for compliance with GDPR, I think, is the recommended way to go. All right? Yeah, and let's be clear. You know, we in the United States are very accustomed to collecting emails without giving much information at all about how we're going to use them. And in our system, we feel more or less protected by the unsubscribe link or button on the email. The wild card is collecting information by various means and using it for tracking and retargeted ads and all of that. That's a whole nother issue. And that's going to be the more complicated type of Hangout that we somehow, some way this summer are going to present. But it's the more difficult approach to what we're trying to provide for you. But let's be clear, we in the United States did not make these rules. And we have had a fairly easy system to comply with up until now. We're being sort of dragged into the 21st century in terms of data security and privacy by the Europeans, right? And so it wasn't too long ago before nobody, well, it was a fairly long time ago, when no one had a privacy policy on their website, right? But then the state of California passed a California statute that says anybody who is selling into California or collecting information, personal information from a California resident has to have a privacy policy. It was California law. It was not federal law that applies to all the states. It was just one state, California, but it was just like the EU right now, saying if you're taking data out of California from our residents, you need to provide a privacy policy that explains what you're going to do with it, among other things. So guess what? The rest of the United States fell into line. Everybody has a privacy policy because they didn't want to screen out California buyers, right? So California sort of created this system whereby everybody had to comply in order to do business. And the EU is doing the same thing. They're creating a system. They're saying, no, we've got a lot of data subjects over here. They buy things. They like to buy things from U.S. companies, and particularly the big ones like Apple and Microsoft and the rest of them, right? Facebook. So now those companies can't say no. A lot of their business comes from over there. So the EU has come up with a very complicated system now of dragging all of us into the 21st century in terms of data security and privacy, because we cannot live without doing business with those people. However, if you're a really small and growing business over here, and based on what your offering is, it's not of particular interest to EU data subjects, you can just screen them out if you want to, or screen them into a process that complies and not worry about it too much. That's bifurcation. But the bigger companies over here really are just going all in. They're just treating everybody as if they were EU data subjects. So that's an overall 30,000-foot view of what's happening. And by the way, as Alan says, it's really going to take a while for all this to really settle out. At the stroke of midnight +1 on the 24th of May, fast approaching, the world isn't going to just instantly change. Now, a lot of the big companies have been working for 2 years or more on trying to get all of these systems built in and all of that. And I would have to imagine that there are plenty of them that are 50%, 60, 70, 80% done, but they're not done. And so it's going to take a while for all of it to settle out. And if you're that small to middle-sized company that typically would be our member, as Alan said, don't freak out over it right now, but follow what we're doing. Get some legal help if you need it. We're going to provide the documents for you and the general guidance. But as far as the specific questions about how you need to comply for your specific business, that means, we're crossing the line into practicing law, which we can't do. We're going to get as close to that as we can, provide you all the assistance in terms of guidance and documents that we can. All right.
The information in our membership site, in the members area, download the documents, update your stuff, check with Weber, Active Campaign, whoever's doing whoever's collecting your stuff. They have a couple of tools you can use. There's a lot of stuff out there, and it's all going to come about a little at a time. And again, it's going to be a work in progress. So just know that. You'll be okay.
Any other questions at this time? Okay, so as indicated earlier this evening and in earlier Hangouts on GDPR, we're continuing to have GDPR-related Hangouts. And as I just indicated a few minutes ago, number 5 is coming up. It will be in June, and we're going to talk about that GDPR-specific privacy notice that applies only to GDPR related data subjects. So we're going to keep plodding through this thing and keep adding to the information that Alan has been placing on the website that he just explained. And we'll be with you every step of the way in terms of general information and documents that should be very helpful for you. All right. No questions? Okay. Well, then, given the fact that we don't have any more questions at this point, let's call this at the end of this presentation, and we'll be back within a month or maybe less with continued coverage of GDPR. So thanks very much for your attendance and your interest and your questions in this presentation, and have a very good, very pleasant, good evening, everyone.